Hi, I'm Sleep Aid, your local sleep paralysis demon, and today we're taking a look at Faker's Light, a webtoon by Soen. And if you would like to submit your comic to be reviewed, you can do so on the Reddit post linked in the description. And speaking of which, I wanted to point out that the author of this comic did state on their post that you will probably criticize my use of classic comic book layout. Let me just preemptively explain this. This is because it's primarily made for print, and so that will be important. We're going to talk about that. But first, let me read the description, and then we'll dive into it. So this is a romance fantasy LGBTQ+, and the description says, a week late for the launch of the latest deep dive VR game, Soen, Dracoon logs in to catch up, but somehow the game starts unexpectedly. Once emerging from the deepest levels of the dungeon he spawned in completely gearless, Dracoon has to fight off mobs of other players hunting him down as a monster, and join hands with an unusual outlaw. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into the first episode, and as was noted by the author, this is formatted for print, and so it is traditional style panel layouts. It is not made for vertical scroll, and so as a result, there are a lot of overlapping panels, there are a lot of smaller panels, and it's a little bit harder to read if you are viewing it on a mobile device. And that is something that I like to point out a lot with Webtoon, is the entire platform is designed around vertical scroll, and so anything that you upload here, you should try to adapt it to the vertical format, because people viewing it on a mobile screen are going to have trouble reading some of the text if it's really small. They're going to have trouble seeing some of the panels if they're really small. So this comic mostly has somewhat large panels, and so even with it being in traditional page layout, I think that on a phone it would still be mostly readable, but a lot of people are probably not going to want to put up with occasionally having to zoom in and pan around, and so that will automatically scare a lot of people off. Unfortunately, 80% of Webtoon's reader base is on mobile device, and so what that means is that if you don't format for vertical scroll, you are losing out on a lot of potential viewers for that reason alone. And so I always recommend that if you're going to publish on Webtoon, even if you make a comic in a traditional page layout, you should make an alternate cut where you separate the panels and stack them vertically so that it looks better on the Webtoon platform, because that will open up your comic to a much larger reader base. It's essentially the entire point of posting on Webtoon is that it has such a large audience, and you're missing out on a lot of that audience if you don't do a vertical format comic. And so I cannot recommend enough that people doing traditional pages make a separate version for Webtoon. I know it's a lot of extra work, but I do think that it is typically worth it, especially for a comic that's as well made as this one. Now then, what stands out about this comic especially is obviously the artwork. It's very well drawn. It has great colors, great environments. Every panel is fully colored, and there are these massive landscapes, and everything looks very nice. It is a very, very good looking comic, and that is probably its greatest strength. It has very good art, and the choice of shots and angles and whatnot make it satisfying to read and fun to look at. And there are a lot of great poses and dynamic movements as we get into it that are just fun to look at, and so it's very, very pleasant. It's certainly a lot of eye candy, if you will. However, I did have some problems with the story of this comic. I felt that it was very, very light on story and perhaps missing some framework elements, and so the first thing that stood out to me was that the characters kind of lack motivation, and so all we really know about our main character at this point is that he is playing a video game while on break in between semesters at college. And so that's it. His entire motivation is just to play a video game, and we don't really get much more than that. The closest that we get to motivation for him is, so he's explained in the real world to have a condition to where he doesn't really feel things. But in the game, because his character is glitched, he has a higher sensitivity to touch, and so he can actually feel things at a level that is higher than what is supposed to be allowed by the game. And so that kind of fascinates him and keeps him, wanting to keep going with this glitched character, because technically it is a glitch that allows him to have such a high touch sensitivity setting, and it's not supposed to be that high. And so, as far as we can tell, that's the only reason that he continues to play the game. And we don't really know why he's playing the game, what he is trying to do in the game, or any goals that he might have. And so the first chapter is pretty simple. He spawns in a dungeon, and so he's trying to figure out how to get out of the dungeon. And so that's pretty straightforward. That's simple motivation. He wants to get out of the dungeon and get to the regular part of the game like everybody else. But once he does that, we don't really have any next step, and he doesn't really have an overarching goal. And I find that none of the characters really do. And for the most part, there are only the two characters. There are the two leads that are the love interests. And so most of the story is essentially just designed to put them together so that they can have lovey-dovey moments and slowly fall for each other, which is typical in a romance comic. That's fine. But yeah, even the love interest doesn't really have any stated goals or motivations, and so we don't know really why he's doing any of the things that he's doing. And I just feel like that's something that I think that it would help to know that. Why are the characters playing the game? What type of gamers are they? Have they played games like this before? How do they feel about this game? Why do they want to play this game? And what goals do they have in the game? Because without that, it's not always clear why things are happening. And there really isn't much of an overarching narrative. There are no real narrative framing devices for this. There's no real major foundation set up with this for an overarching narrative, and so it kind of makes me not really sure if there is one outside of the two characters slowly falling in love, which even takes a while to get to because we spend so much time in the early chapters getting familiar with our main character and his struggle to escape this dungeon, but it takes a very long time for the love interest to get introduced, and that's something that is also exacerbated by the Webtoon uploading system. Since only a few pages are being turned into entire episodes, you're constantly having to click to the next page and wait for it to load and then scroll down it, and then so it makes it feel like it's taking even longer than it actually is. It makes the pacing feel even slower when the pacing isn't that slow, but it just feels slow because you're having to click through so many episodes compared to an average Webtoon. And so that's something that, again, just the Webtoon platform doesn't really favor really short updates like this. And I think that it does hurt the reading experience a little bit. But as I said, the primary focus of the story seems to be on the relationship that's being built, but outside of that, there's not really an overarching narrative. And as far as we can tell, our characters are just playing a game for the sake of recreation. We don't really know what their goals in the game are, and there's really no conflict. So initially, when our main character escapes the dungeon, the other players of the game think that he's a monster and there were, an enemy in the game, and they try to hunt him down to kill him and take his loot. And so he's immediately running away, trying to escape. and he ends up getting saved by the love interest, who is the second male lead. And essentially, the love interest, Hunter is his name, he extorts the main character, says that he'll, spare his life in exchange for information on the dungeon. And so they end up going into the dungeon together, but then ultimately that quest into the dungeon ends, they get out of it, and that's just it. There's nothing further than that. And immediately we have this conflict being set up where other players think the main character's a monster. They want to hunt him down because they think it's some kind of quest or something, but then there's a chapter later where the developers find out about his glitched account, and they have a very long conversation amongst themselves where they agree to watch over his character because he's essentially testing features for them by using this strange account that isn't supposed to be possible. And so they say that they'll keep an eye on things to make sure that other players don't just constantly hunt him down. And so essentially the conflict with other characters hunting him down kind of goes away there, because now we know that the developers are going to intervene if anything untoward is done. And we also, in that same scene, have the developers explain why his character is glitched the way it is, because he's playing on an incorrect version of the game that wasn't supposed to be possible to download, and so he's using features that were supposed to be removed from the game before it launched. And so that also takes away all of the mystery about why he spawned in a dungeon and why his character is different from others. And so all of the mystique and all of the conflict is removed in that scene, and there isn't really any other overarching narrative. And it just kind of makes it harder to get invested in the story, because while it is fun to watch the very slow growth of the relationship between the two characters, there's a lot of hints at feelings building and attraction building and things like that, and all that stuff is very well done, but there isn't really any story beyond that. And that makes it a little bit harder to invest in, because it feels like a comic that presents itself as though it's going to have a lot of plot, a really big story, because we spend so long with our character escaping the dungeon and figuring out different game mechanics and things like that, but a lot of that kind of goes by the wayside after that developer conversation. And so now all we're left with is two people in a video game having cute and fun romancy interactions and being lovey-dovey with each other, which is fun if that's what you're looking for, but I feel like it kind of lacks momentum for a plot. It lacks a real moving plot. And so now at this point, after the developer conversation, which I haven't shown on screen yet, that's further in, but after that developer conversation, again, where they explain what our main character is, why he is that way, and also that they're going to make sure that he's not constantly hunted by other players, after that scene, there's no tension left in the story except for the building romantic tension between the two main characters. But the trouble with that is we don't really know much about either of them. And so we know a little bit about our main character, but not very much. We see bits of his personality over the course of the comic through his struggles, but we don't really see his full personality start to come out until later interactions that he has with the love interest. And again, since we don't really have much character motivation built up, we don't have much to be invested in. Simultaneously, the love interest we know even less about, because we haven't seen him outside of the game at all. So we don't know who he is in the real world. We don't know what type of player he is in the game. We don't know what his goals are in the game. And we don't really know why he's doing any of the things that he's doing, other than the fact that he starts to gain an attraction to the main character, and thus wants to, in a stoic way, help him out. And so we have very little to latch onto from the plot, and very little to latch onto from the characters. And so essentially the main draw of this comic is that you have two very well-drawn characters in these fun and sometimes silly lovey-dovey situations as they are slowly getting closer to each other, becoming friends, and then probably becoming lovers after that, which seems to be the whole point of the comic. But yeah, it does feel like it's missing a lot of elements in the plot, in the world building, and in the character backgrounds themselves. And I think that all of those things would probably help to invest more in the relationship if we had more info on kind of what these characters were trying to accomplish, what they were doing, and who they are, and also if there was more of an overarching plot to help drive things along. And so it feels like a lot of the scenarios that we encounter over the course of this comic are kind of just excuses to create these nice drawings where our characters do cutesy things together. And so you have a lot of moments like this where we show the dynamic and the physicality of it, and all that stuff is well done. It's just, I don't know if it is enough to keep me invested in. And so you end up with a lot of these. Like, this is a very pretty panel. There are a lot of panels like this between these two characters because it's constantly reinforcing the tension between them, and that's kind of the purpose of the whole comic. So this is the type of thing that this would make a really good post on social media. Out of context, you can derive a lot of information from a panel like this. You've got your one character dominant, kind of leaning in, your other one less dominant, shall we say, almost a little bit concerned, not really sure about the whole thing. And this is establishing effectively what the relationship dynamic will be, or at least the footing that we're on right now. But there are also a few table flips of this and other demonstrations of how the dynamics of these characters work. But this is the type of thing that, again, I think that as a post on social media, a picture like this, even with no dialogue, would do very well, because you could look at it and see exactly what it is and understand immediately the dynamic, and it helps your imagination to run, and you kind of get something out of this right away. But in the context of the comic, I feel like I wish that there was more to dwell on story-wise. So there are a lot of moments like this where you can look at something like this, and it's kind of like a piece of candy. It's eye candy. It's something that, you look at and your heart beats, I guess, and that's very nice for a pulpy romance comic, but it does feel like there's a deeper narrative buried in here somewhere, because occasionally you'll get pages like this where there's just an excess of information on how the game works and some of the elements of the game, but a lot of that stuff doesn't really get explained much in the comic, and that, I think, is something that hurts it a little bit, because in the beginning of the comic, when our character is still trying to escape the dungeon, we see a very technical side of the game. We see him doing a lot of trial and error. He's mapping out these floors of this dungeon and finding where the danger is and what to avoid and how to escape, and he's using cleverness to puzzle his way out of these situations, and it's very gamified, and that stuff is really fun to read as someone who's played a lot of games, and it's definitely relatable. But we don't really get too much more of that later, and so it feels like the game elements are going to be a lot more technical based on the early episodes, but then as it progresses, a lot of the gameplay doesn't get explained, and we don't really know much about how this game works at all. We don't really know how the combat works, how the stats work, the levels, the systems, or even the world or travel or anything. And so it feels like something is missing as far as the world building goes. And I know that with a game world like this, a lot of it is going to be playing off of the audience's preconceptions, and so it kind of assumes that you've played a game similar to this before, an online fantasy game. And so anybody that has will probably be able to fill in a lot of the blanks on their own, but I do think that it's kind of important whenever using a story like this, a game-based story. I think that explaining some of the systems to the readers can help them get excited about what's happening on screen. And also, though, it is a difficult balancing act because obviously you don't want to over-explain things. And so that can make the world building very tough. But I do feel like this comic sometimes over-explains things, but it often doesn't explain enough. And so I don't really feel like I know enough about how this game works. And I couldn't imagine myself playing it because I don't know anything about it. Which is to say that it's a little bit harder to get immersed in. It's harder to get invested in. But man, the art is pretty, and so you keep on scrolling because you get panels like this, and they're just fun to look at, and it's very well constructed. I think I would describe, though, probably my perception of the game systems. It's kind of like the hard magic versus soft magic discussion, whereas this is a common terminology in world building, but I would refer to it as hard game systems versus soft game systems, I guess, in this case, wherein a hard game system is where there are very, very rigid rules, and it's all technical, and it all is almost like scientific in how it works. And so it all follows a rigid structure, whereas a soft system is one where you don't really explain the details too much, and you kind of just make it up as you go, and so you're never really forced to uphold any laws or rules because you're kind of just making it up as you go. It's very, like, fluid and free-moving, and so oftentimes a lot of stories, comics especially, will start out with a soft system where the author is just making things up without really abiding by anything, and then over time they start to form rules, and it'll turn into a hard system based on things that happened in the earlier system, whereas this one kind of feels like it goes back and forth, whereas it starts out kind of explaining a lot of rules. It starts out feeling like a hard system, but then in the middle it gets less technical and it kind of ignores some of the systems and things, but then every now and then there's a moment that reminds you that there are rules, and it feels like it goes back and forth between really caring about the game mechanics and not caring as much about the game mechanics. And those are just those things that can be very distracting for me, where I can't tell really, again, how the game works. And so I'm just constantly wondering, like, is this a hard system? Is this a soft system? Is it somehow both? But I feel like it would be better if it was one or the other. If it was going to be a really, really technical and scientific game with a rigid stat system and whatnot, then that's fine as long as it commits to that. But if it's not going to commit to that, it would be better to probably explain some of the things less. Like the developer conversation episode, I felt really over-explained a lot of things. It got a little bit too technical, whereas in moments like this, we've got, there are loose allusions to skills and weapons and how things can be summoned from hotbars, but we don't really get much info on, like, the stats, how much damage is being done, what things we should be worried about, and, what a player might be thinking in these moments. And so it feels more like a soft system in a fight like this, where they're using the terrain to their advantage and, doing things that you wouldn't necessarily do in a video game, but that you could do in a virtual reality. And there are little touches like the potion being drank and things like that, but I don't know. It just feels kind of inconsistent in how technical the game is, what gets explained versus what doesn't get explained. And so it can be a little bit off-putting at times because you sometimes forget that it's a game, and then other times it's impossible to forget. Other times you're reading a several-page conversation between the developers talking about how the programming broke to allow the main character to exist and little things like that. And so it's that constant shifting of the severity of the game systems, I think, was a little bit distracting to me. And so overall, that really sums it up, I think, is just the story for me is a little bit light on story. And I felt that based on the way the first chapter played out, I thought it was going to be more narratively driven. I thought it was going to be more of a story, but the later episodes feel more like a pulpy romance style comic, and yeah, I'm just not really sure what to make of it. Because again, we've kind of arrived at a point where there's no longer an overarching narrative, and so it's hard to really know what to be invested in, because having read all of the current episodes, I don't really know what there is to look forward to other than seeing the characters interact with each other more. But I wish that I was more invested in the story. I wish that there were more story things for me to latch on to, like plot beats being set up, things being foreshadowed that will happen soon, but there isn't really. It's kind of just tune in and find out what happens, but you can't really speculate because you're not really given much to work with. And yeah, I think that overall that probably is my biggest criticism, is just that there's not really much of an overarching story. And again, I wish I knew more about the characters and kind of who they are and what their goals are, and a little bit more info on the game would help as well, and then we could figure out, what our characters' goals are within the confines of the game. Why are they playing this game? What do they want to get out of this game? What are they trying to accomplish in it? And those types of things would really help a lot. Overall, though, I did think it was an enjoyable read, and if your primary focus is on the fluffy romance stuff, if you're just looking for, a slow build relationship, then this is a good comic for that. It delivers a lot of that. And so if you're only focused on the romance aspect, I think it does that fairly well. And I think that a lot of people would be very satisfied with that, especially with the art being as good as it is. That really helps a lot. So yeah, overall I think it was a good read. A bit lighter on story than I was hoping it would be. And I was left with a lot of questions, but not the good kind of questions. More just things that I wish were explained better. And so I hope that some of those questions get answered in the future. I hope that we do end up learning more about these characters in this game world and have some kind of journey that we can get invested in. But overall, as I said, I do think it is very good in its current state. It seems to deliver. It's definitely delivering on the genre that it's classified as, and so it is doing a lot of things right. It's just fun to look at. Anyways, I think that's about it. I think that's all I've really got to say on the matter, so that is Faker's Light. Go ahead and give it a read. I think I would recommend it. Although it is a little bit harder to read on Webtoon, so I think I would recommend it if you're reading on a desktop. It's probably going to be hard to read on a mobile device, but or you could buy the print version, I suppose. But anyways, that's about all I've got. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in your nightmares.